Welcome, and thank you for attending my presentation. What I will talk about today is the question, how can AI ecosystems be designed to support human flourishing? This presentation is based on work that I've done with a number of colleagues in the Sherpa project, and I'll say a few more things about the Sherpa project in a moment. My name is Bernd Stahl. I'm professor at the Montfort University, which is in Leicester in the UK. Before I come to the content of my presentation, let me do a quick introduction of where I'm from. So for those of you who don't know where Leicester is, you see this on the map on the left here. It's somewhere in the middle of England. And the research group that I had in the Montfort University is called the Center for Computing and Social Responsibility. We have been doing stuff around ethics and social aspects of information technology for more than a quarter of a century now. So we had our 25-year anniversary last year, and we're a reasonably big group with roughly 25 members of staff who do various things of interest in the area of ethics and IT. We have been running the Ethicom conference series since 1995, and we've got a couple of journals, and we do a number of projects. So one of these projects that I'm going to focus on is the Sherpa project. Sherpa was an EU-funded project that ran from 2018 to October of 2021. So it finished recently. And what I will do here is give you a brief overview of some of the work we've done and try to answer the question of what AI ecosystems might look like and how they can be steered. I will start by going through the logic of the project and the questions that we raised, and I will then look at some of the answers and try to summarize the findings. So the first challenge that we face when thinking about artificial intelligence is what are the issues, or what level of agreement is there on what ethical issues are and how human rights are impacted by AI. So in the project, we use the term SIS, which stands for Smart Information Systems. So smart information systems are those systems that draw on AI techniques, but that sit in a broader context, that sit within a socio-technical, socio-economic context where AI is being used. So we used that term in the Sherpa project, mostly because we felt that the AI concept was not sufficiently well defined. And again, I'll come back to that in a moment. But given that at this point, the discussion is very much around AI, and AI is the topic that people use, or it's the term that people use when they discuss these questions, we have, over the lifetime of the project, moved away from SIS and used more the concept of AI. However, the slides which are based on the project still make use of SIS. So these are smart information systems. So first challenge is, what are these things? What are the ethical implications? What are the human rights implications of these systems? And in order to answer this question, we've done a number of case studies. We've developed a set of scenarios. We've also looked at the technical side of things, in particular at cyber security questions. And we've looked at the literature around ethical impacts as well as human rights law. To give you an indication of what we've looked at, so these are the topic areas of our case studies. So the case studies in each case consisted of a number of interviews, typically in one organization. In some cases, we looked at related organizations, and we tried to find out what current companies, public authorities, or other types of organizations do when they employ such smart information systems, and how they perceive the issues that arise and how they deal with them. So we looked at government, we looked at the use of AI in agriculture, we looked at scientific research, at smart cities, we looked at applications of the Internet of Things, we looked at an insurance company, we looked at utilities, communication, we looked at retail and trade, and we also had a look at manufacturing. So we tried to get a broad understanding of what these applications of these technologies might look like. We also then tried to extrapolate a bit more into the future and focused here on topics and applications which are already there, so that none of these are completely off the wall, but which we expect to become more prevalent, more important, and more the center of attention in the next 3 to 5 years. So these are predictive policing, the use of AI in warfare, deep fakes or mimicking technologies. We looked at AI in education and autonomous vehicles. So this was the first question: is what are the challenges? What are the issues? What do we encounter? And the second step then, or the second challenge, was that we realized that even though we were a relatively large consortium, Of course, this is a much broader discussion, so we needed to understand what the broader landscape of social perceptions are. So what do people see as competing rights and interests? And for that, we reached out to stakeholders in various ways. So we had a stakeholder board that was part of the project. We did a number of interviews, we did an online survey, and we had a Delphi study to broaden our understanding of these issues. Then we also wanted to look at what are options to encounter or to address these concerns. For that, we developed what we call a workbook, which is basically a page on our website. And we looked specifically at the following options. So we looked at guidelines both for researchers and for innovators in companies for dealing with those ethical issues of AI. We looked at regulatory options. In particular, we put some emphasis on terms of reference for a regulator. So what might a regulator of AI look like? We worked with standards bodies, we looked at standardization potential, and again, we looked at technical aspects, in particular in the area of cybersecurity. The next step then was to understand whether any of those suggestions would work, how they would work, and that we did basically through a number of focus groups. So we took our insights, our suggestions, our recommendations, and worked through them with stakeholders in various ways and in various jurisdictions to find out which of our suggestions would be most likely to work. And then we also took the next step, or we started to take the next step, and we looked at not just the normal dissemination and communication activities, which you find in most EU projects, but we also looked at other ways of engaging. So important is the last point here is that we had an advocacy arm. So we explicitly reached out to, in particular, European policymakers. And of course, the timing was very good because the project took place during the preparation of the white paper and the first draft of the planned regulation of AI in the European Union. And we also, I think quite importantly, had an artist in residence, a member of the consortium, who tried to use artistic means to represent and find ways of talking about these things in order to address further audiences. So that was the logic of the project. Now I'll come to the content. So why do we use AI? So what's the purpose of AI? And I think there are various different purposes that you can find in the literature and in publications. The most dominant one is around making things work better in some way. So it's creating higher levels of efficiency, it's optimizing. In the end, that often translates into profit maximization of the company using the technology. That is dominant. I think that's what you see most frequently, but it's certainly not the only reason for using AI. Another one, potentially contentious, is that of social control. So you use AI technologies in order to make people do what you want them to do. A primary example of that might be the Chinese social credit scoring system, but there are others where AI is used to exert control over people. And we contrasted those with a third one, which we called human flourishing. So this is where we think that that's one way of expressing ethical intention to allow people to live to their potential, to live their lives as they please. Now, it's important to see that these three are not necessarily contradictory. So I'm not saying that if you promote efficiency, that's necessarily detrimental to human flourishing. In fact, it may be the opposite. But what this is about is the main purpose, the main emphasis on why an AI is being developed or being put in practice. And what we are suggesting is that human flourishing is a way of thinking and framing AI that has ethical implications, typically ethically beneficial implications. So coming back to what is AI? Now that is an important question clearly for this conference and also for questions around regulation, around dealing with ethical concerns. So one example of a definition, this is a very policy-oriented definition. The first one here, this comes from the European Commission in the white paper, which is a very broad one as a collection of technologies that combine data, algorithms, and computing power. Or you find more academically oriented definitions such as this one, where the reference is to certain types of mental activities or activities that we typically associate with mental activities such as perception, memory, emotion, and so on. Now, this is it comes from a publication by the publisher Elsevier, who you may know as one of the biggest academic publishers in the world, who have very good access to a lot of academic publications. And they did a study to find out what does the discourse on artificial intelligence actually contain. And so the picture on the left here is the title of their publication. And it's worth looking at. It's a few years old at this point. I think it's from 2018 or 19. But they identified a number of keywords, I think 400 somewhere around, and then tried to cluster them to find out what exactly is it that people talk about when they use the term AI. And the interesting thing, or the interesting finding from this piece of research, is that there is no common core. There are several topic areas that keep recurring, but there's nothing that all references to AI always have in common. So that's a problem, because it means that AI is not a clearly defined concept, but it is sort of a family of concepts. And those include things like machine learning, natural language processing, fuzzy logic. But there is nothing at the center that all of them always cover. So what we try to do in the Sherpa project then is to look at, well, how do people use the concept in daily practice? And this really was an analysis of our case studies and the scenarios. And we asked, so how do they use this? And one family or one group of usages of the term is that of machine learning. Now, traditional narrow AI, which is certainly at the heart of a lot of the discussion of AI at the moment. But it's not the only thing. So the other thing, the next group of users is what we would call converging socio-technical systems. So the idea is that this is where a machine learning, typically a machine learning technique, is somewhere at the core of a broader system that includes humans, but it also includes other technical systems that produce data, that go back to the world. So examples of that would be, let's say, a fraud detection system in an insurance. Now there is a machine learning core to it, but it has much broader connotations than that. And then finally, there is what's sometimes called general AI, or artificial general intelligence, or good old-fashioned intelligence. So this idea that you have technologies which are truly human in their abilities. Now, none of these, no such technology currently exists, but it is something that is referred to in the discourse. Now, each of these three groups of AI has different types of characteristics. So machine learning is difficult to understand because the states of the system change over time. It may be unpredictable, and it requires big data both for training and for validation purposes. These converging socio-technical systems are typically described as having large social impact. They can be manipulatory, they can make people do stuff, and they are often seen as autonomous. And then finally, artificial general intelligence is characterized by its reference to human nature, to the nature of intelligence, to the questions of what counts as reality. Now, if we take these three groups, then the question is, what are the ethical issues? And you can do some mapping between those. So there are specific issues related to machine learning, and there are broader questions around how we live in the digital world, which are related to those converging socio-technical systems. And finally, there are metaphysical questions, which have to do with artificial general intelligence. So examples of such ethical issues for machine learning are things like biases and discrimination, which we know can be integrated or can be imported into a system through biased data, for example. There are questions around security. There are questions around data protection, which arise from the need of having large amounts of data. The broader questions around living in a digital world are things like the autonomy. How do these systems affect our autonomy as users? There are questions around power, that's political power, but also economic power, the concerns about the market power of the big internet companies, questions around future of warfare, who benefits, who pays for these things, how do we balance these questions? And then on the metaphysical side, we have things like what's going to happen? Will there be a superintelligence? Will there be a singularity? Does it change human nature? Now, what you see here is that these are very different questions, and these different questions require different answers. So some of these may be capable of being addressed locally through technical means. Explainable AI is an attempt to, for example, deal with some of the specific questions from machine learning. Some of these are really political questions. Now, these are not technical questions, but these call for a societal level discussion around what we want to achieve with technology in society. And some of these are really fundamental questions from philosophy, maybe even theology, which may not be subject to a resolution, but which require ongoing reflection. The point here is that we have lots of different ethical issues. And they are not just many of them, but they have very different levels and very different complexity. The same can be said about what we can do about them. So these are what we call mitigation measures. So there are, as distinguished, 4 of them here. So there are policy approaches, there are organizational approaches, technical and individual ones. So examples of policy would be specific regulations, such as the forthcoming EU AI Act, but there can also be other types of regulation which are relevant to AI. And that can be things like human rights law, like competition law, labor law, you name them. On an organizational level, there are various different things that the organizations can do in order to address AI, such as risk assessment, impact assessment, quality assurance. All of these are things that many organizations already do, which could be extended to AI. Technically, there are ways of dealing with data protection, design guidelines, methodologies. Standards may be suitable here, in particular with regards to security. And finally, for individuals, there are various types of guidance mechanisms, from ethics frameworks, of which we have a proliferation now, through professional approaches, through methodologies, and so on. Again, the point being, there are different types of interventions. And then within those different types, there are lots of different ways of going about it. And then finally, to add to the complexity, have a quick look at the stakeholders. So I suggest there are 3 groups. You could carve this up differently, but there certainly are policy stakeholders, there are organizational stakeholders, and there are individuals. And again, you have loads of different examples of that. So you have large European or large political bodies such as the EU, but you also have national policymakers, you have funding policymakers, you have ethics bodies, and so on. There are lots of different types of organizations, including those that develop, deploy, and use AI, but there are also other organizations in this AI ecosystem and space, such as media, educators. And then finally, there are individuals who also, of course, make up those collective stakeholder groups, but they also can play individual roles as users, as activists, but possibly also as non-users. So what this leads us to is that this is a fairly complicated landscape. And there is no magic bullet which is going to take care of the ethics of AI. So this is partly to do with the epistemic complexity, but it's also to do with the changing nature of AI, the technical progress, and the fact that there are lots of already existing responsibilities that are aimed at addressing these questions. So what we need is an intelligent mix of options of interventions. And in the Sherpa project, we have suggested that it might be useful, rather than think about AI as a type of technology which is subject to a particular intervention, to take the metaphor of an ecosystem and look at what would it mean to interpret AI as an ecosystem, or even as an ecosystem of ecosystems. So the question then is, well, coming back to this idea of flourishing, how could we move towards AI as an ecosystem that promotes human flourishing? Now, in order to look at this question and to come up with an answer, we've looked at the innovation ecosystem literature, which is a fairly extensive literature, typically from the innovation studies field, and looked at how are ecosystems, innovation ecosystems in particular, described. So they have unclear boundaries. It's not necessarily clear who's in, who's out. They're open, so members can join or leave ecosystems. One of the reasons why people use the concept is that it explains change. So evolution is seen as a driver of change. Evolution can imply competition, but it can also mean cooperation, co-evolution, and mutual learning. The actors within the ecosystems are not independent, they are interdependent. So you can't just pick them up individually and work with them, but you have to look at the system as a whole. And finally, the relationship between those actors are complex. So it's very rare that you find linear relationships, simple cause-effect relationships in systems in general, and innovation ecosystems as well. So what needs to be the case for an intervention into an ecosystem to work, to have an impact? So on the one hand, it's got to be clear what exactly the ecosystem is. So it's a question of delimitation. And the delimitation in terms of AI can be a geographical. So the European AI ecosystem is probably different from the American one, probably different from the Chinese one. But it's also a conceptual and technical one. So what exactly is the technology you're talking about, and how do you conceptualize it? Secondly, an ecosystem, in order to move towards human flourishing, requires a knowledge base. So this includes the technical knowledge base, but also a conceptual and procedural one. So how do we deal with ethics? How do we understand stakeholders? What capacity has there to be in order to ensure that these questions can be successfully addressed in the future? And finally, there are questions of governance. So what governance structures exist in an ecosystem? We believe that this has to be flexible. There has to be adaptive governance. Ecosystems need to be able to learn. And the final point, which we call meta responsibility, is around how do we organize existing responsibilities in a way that the governance structures are mutually conducive. So these are the three main requirements for interventions. And around that, we have suggested our recommendations, which basically follow the same logic. So we've said that there's got to be a delimitation, there's got to be governance, and there has to be a knowledge base. And then we've come up with a number of specific recommendations. So in the delimitation part, we said there needs to be conceptual clarity. So what exactly is it we're talking about? Going back to the earlier question of the complexity of the concept of AI. What exactly is the AI in question? In terms of governance, we are suggesting that there needs to be a regulatory framework, something that might look like the EU AI Act. It might be legislative framework, but there needs to be a governance structure, a regulatory framework that works. We are suggesting that there needs to be and we call it as an EU agency because we're an EU project, but the idea is that there will be a body that's sort of the gatekeeper for the discourse on the ethics of AI. And we're suggesting that on an organizational level, it would be useful to have a role in an organization. We call this here the AI ethics officer, that would look after the combination of the technical and the social / ethical / legal side of AI. With regards to knowledge, we are suggesting that it would be useful to have a baseline for what an AI impact assessment might look like. We are suggesting that ethics by design guidelines might help foster sensitivity to the ethics of AI. We're thinking that there needs to be training, education, standardization certainly has an important role to play. And we believe that there are specific security issues that need to be addressed. So these are our recommendations, and you can look them up in a lot more detail on our website. The point, though, is that these are, while they are individual recommendations, so we have 9 individual recommendations here, they should be seen in combination. So it's not good enough to just pick out one, but these are interdependent. So for example, the limitation of the ecosystem is required in order to form the basis of the knowledge base. The knowledge base in turn informs what we think about the concept of AI. Similarly, governance structures may incentivize the creation of knowledge bases, and the knowledge base will inform the governance structure. Governance will need to look at what exactly are the boundaries of the system. So there are relationships between those big bubbles, and similarly, there are relationships within those bubbles. So a regulatory framework might mandate an agency, might mandate the existence of an AI ethics officer. An ethics by design approach might require training and education. It might include an impact assessment, or it might call for security. And finally, there are also relationships between those bubbles. So the creation of an AI ethics officer might call for training and education. A regulatory framework might require an impact assessment. So the point here is that we need to think about these. You can pick out any individual one of those, but in order to be successful, I think we need to look at this whole systems approach. Now, this is a different picture of the same thing. So this is the picture that you'll find on our website of the Sherpa project, where we have those 3 main bubbles and the individual recommendations that constitute them. So we believe that this approach, thinking about AI as a system, as an ecosystem, as a system of systems, is much more likely to allow us to identify and successfully deal with the ethics of AI, rather than a specific suggestion that would just address one particular aspect. If you're interested in any of this, there's a book that we've published around this. This is available open access, where all of these ideas are developed in a lot more detail. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention.